It was late at night in 2017, and I was in the middle of a deserted road in Texas, fighting sleep after hours of driving. I desperately needed a rest, so when I saw a pit stop in the distance, I decided to stop. The place looked old, kind of abandoned, but I had no other choice. The wind was icy, and the silence around me was almost stifling. Only the noise of my truck's engine filled the void. I grabbed my flashlight, entered the main building, and headed toward the bathroom. It was strange. That place seemed quieter than it should have been. The air inside the building was dense, as if no one had been there for years. The floor creaked with my every step, and the walls, covered in damp stains, reflected the light from my flashlight in an unsettling way. It was as if the place was waiting for something or someone. Finally, I got to the bathroom. The door was heavy, with deep scratch marks that looked fresh. I hesitated before entering, but necessity spoke louder. I pushed the door hard, and it slowly opened, revealing an environment that seemed even more uncomfortable than the rest of the pit stop. The walls were peeling, the mirrors shattered to pieces, and the musty smell was almost unbearable. There were 3 cabins, all with their doors closed. The light from the flashlight flickered as I scanned the space. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't identify what it was. Maybe it was the absolute silence, or maybe the fact that the main door seemed heavier than it should have been. I decided to ignore my instincts and hurry. I went to the sink, washed my face with water that came out of the rusty tap little by little, trying to ward off sleep. But what really woke me up was the sound. A slight creak coming from one of the cabins. It wasn't constant, just enough to make me freeze in place. I stood still, flashlight pointed at the ground, my heart racing. I waited for anything that would explain the sound. But the silence returned, more oppressive than before. I took a step back, feeling my stomach turn. And then, like a reflex, the door to the last cabin creaked again, this time louder. I knew I wasn't alone. As soon as I entered the bathroom, I felt something strange in the air. It was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was a smell I couldn't identify, something between mold and iron. The lights on the ceiling flickered erratically, and the sound of drops falling from a broken faucet echoed through the space. I looked around. All the pits were open, except for the last one. The door was locked. I stood there for a moment, staring at that box, and that's when I heard it. A low, hoarse voice, almost a whisper, came from within. "Help me? He's here." My heart raced. Who was he? And who was asking for help there? The voice sounded weak, almost as if the person was struggling to speak. The sound echoed through the bathroom, making it impossible to ignore the urgency in those words. My first reaction was to take a step back, but my eyes were still fixed on the locked door. "Anyone there?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I'd like. There was no response, just the distant sound of the dripping faucet and the low hum of the lights. That feeling that something was deeply wrong began to grow. I looked around again, almost hoping someone would come out of some hidden corner, but the bathroom was empty except for me and that voice. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I took a step toward the locked stall, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I knocked lightly on the door. "Are you right in there?" I asked again. This time, the silence was cut by another, quieter, almost imperceptible whisper. "Don't let him in." My stomach turned. Before I could process what was happening, a sound came from outside the bathroom. It was the sound of slow footsteps, echoing in the hallway. Each step seemed heavier, closer. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. He knew exactly where he was going. The voice inside the box murmured again, this time desperate. "It's coming. Please go away." I swallowed hard, not knowing what to do. Something told me that if I stayed, it wouldn't just be the person inside the box who would be in danger. But my legs felt locked, unable to move, while the footsteps outside continued, closer and closer. For some reason that I still can't explain, I decided to open that door. Maybe it was the instinct to help, or maybe it was pure curiosity. But I pushed. When the door opened, all I found was an empty box. But what I saw on the walls made me freeze, deep scratches and scattered red stains. It was as if someone had tried to get out of there with their fingernails, desperate. The cuts on the wall were jagged, and the stains had a hue that made my stomach turn. For a moment, I was paralyzed, staring at the scene as if my brain refused to accept what was in front of me. Before I could process what I was seeing, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a visceral sensation, as if the air around me had suddenly become colder. I heard footsteps behind me, light but unmistakable steps. My whole body froze. I knew I had to turn around, but fear kept me frozen for a few seconds. Finally, I mustered up my courage and slowly turned around, but there was no one there. My breathing became heavy, and the sound of my heartbeat seemed to fill the entire bathroom. But then something caught my attention: the mirror above the sinks. In the reflection, I saw something that made my heart stop: a dark, tall figure standing in the corner of the bathroom. His shape was indistinct, but there was something about his posture that made me feel like I was being watched closely, analyzed. I swallowed hard and turned my head slowly to look directly at the corner where the figure should be. But the space was empty. Nothing. Just the same dirty and musty corner as before. I looked back into the mirror, but now the reflection showed only me, my pale face and wide eyes, full of terror. The silence in the bathroom became unbearable. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above me. My whole body was tense, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Something inside me knew that I had made a mistake, that opening that door had awakened something I couldn't understand. And the scariest thing was the feeling that even though I was alone, I wasn't really alone. I ran. I don't know how my legs took me so fast, but before I knew it, I was already outside the building, jumping into my truck. My hands were shaking so much that it took me 2 attempts to get the key into the ignition. I started the engine, but my breathing was uncontrolled. I tried to convince myself that I was safe now, but every cell in my body screamed otherwise. I accelerated as fast as I could, the wheels of the truck skidding for a moment in the loose dirt before they gained traction. The sound of the engine filled the silence of the night, but it was not enough to stifle the fear inside me. My mind was a mess, revisiting everything that had happened. The voice, the empty box, the scratches, the reflection. None of this made sense, but the fear was real. By reflex, I looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw him again. The shadowy figure was standing at the bathroom door, watching me walk away. His form seemed even more defined now, as if the darkness around him had taken on a life of its own. His eyes shone, not with an ordinary light, but with something impossible to describe, almost mesmerizing. And there was a smile, a wide, distorted smile that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of a human face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a warning. I looked away quickly, my breathing quickening even more. But even after being miles away from that place, the feeling didn't go away. I felt as if I was still being watched, as if that being had marked me in some way. Every shadow on the road seemed deeper. Every lighthouse on the horizon seemed a threat. When I finally stopped at a gas station to try to compose myself, I noticed that my hands were still shaking. The attendant looked at me with an expression of concern, but I couldn't say anything. How could I explain something that even I couldn't understand? All I knew was that it wasn't over. The shadowy figure wasn't something I could just leave behind. After that night, I vowed never to stop in a deserted place like that. I told my story to other truck drivers, and some of them said they had seen something similar at that same pit stop. The next time you feel like something is wrong, trust your instincts. Sometimes the greatest danger is not in what you see, but in what is lurking in the shadows. Now, when I pass through places like this, I just speed up, because sometimes the real danger is not what is in front of you, but what you should not have seen. The missing gas station attendant. It was 2013 and I was coming back from a trip with some friends. It was late at night, and the road seemed endless. That's when we saw a small gas station on the side of the road. We were almost out of fuel, so we had no choice but to stop. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. The lights flickered, the paint was peeling, and everything looked old and abandoned. As soon as we stopped, a gas station attendant appeared from behind the pump. He was thin, with pale skin and deep dark circles. Something about him seemed wrong. He was constantly looking at the surrounding forest, as if he was waiting for something. My friends also noticed his strangeness. "This guy looks like he came out of a horror movie," whispered one of them, trying to ease the tension with humor. But the nervous tone in his voice made it clear that he was as uncomfortable as I was. The gas station attendant finally approached the car window. His voice was low and hoarse as he asked, "Complete the tank?" I just nodded, unable to look away from him. As he began to fill the tank, I noticed that his eyes were always moving sideways, focusing on the shadows around the post. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. There was an eerie silence in the air, broken only by the sound of fuel flowing and the hum of fluorescent lights above. I looked at the surrounding forest, trying to see what he was watching so much, but all I saw were trees and darkness. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong did not disappear. As soon as he handed me the change, he finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," he said, his voice charged with a strange urgency. While he was filling up the car, my friends and I stayed in the car watching. His behavior was increasingly strange. He looked nervous, looking from side to side, as if he was waiting for something or running away from something. The silence around us was broken by a peculiar sound, whispers, coming from the forest. It was as if someone was calling out to him. The whispers were quiet, almost indistinct, but they were impossible to ignore. I leaned toward the window, trying to hear better, but my friends reacted immediately. "Don't open the window," said one, fear evident in his voice. They were also scared, and the tension inside the car only increased by the second. Outside, the gas station attendant dropped the hose in the middle of the fueling, the fuel running down the floor without him seeming to notice. He took a few uncertain steps toward the forest, as if the whispers were calling to him. "Hey, where are you going? The tank isn't full yet," I shouted, lowering the window just enough for my voice to come out. But he did not answer. He kept walking, his steps slow and shuffling, as if hypnotized. The lights of the post flickered even more, casting strange shadows that seemed to move around him. My mind was screaming to get out of there, but I couldn't look away. Something about that scene held me, even as fear grew inside me. I looked out into the woods, trying to see what he saw, but all there was darkness. Even so, the whispers continued, growing louder and more urgent by the second. My friend started begging me to start the car and get out of there, but I hesitated. The gas station attendant had disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and the sound of branches breaking in the distance was the last thing we heard before absolute silence returned. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, waiting for him to come back, but he just disappeared among the trees. The forest was so dark that it seemed to swallow anything that entered. The sound of whispers had ceased, but the silence that remained was even more disturbing. It was as if the world around us had stopped. That wait seemed endless. My friends argued in low voices, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I decided to get out of the car and walk to the pump to see if I could understand what was happening. As soon as I opened the door, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Clear. She held tightly, her face pale and full of fear. "Don't go," she said, almost whispering. "Something's wrong here." I wanted to insist, to say that we needed to understand what was happening, but something in her voice made me hesitate. Before he could answer, the lights at the station began to flicker violently. The irregular lighting cast strange shadows that seemed to dance around us. Each blink made my heart beat faster. By reflex, I looked at the forest. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something. It wasn't the gas station attendant. It was a tall, almost grotesque figure, with unusually long arms and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. My whole body froze, and for a second I couldn't breathe. The figure was still, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it filled all the space around us. The next moment, the lights went out completely. The world around us has been plunged into absolute darkness. My friends began to scream, and the sound of the screams was quickly swallowed up by the silence of the night. I didn't know what to do. Everything inside me told me to run, but my legs felt stuck to the ground. At that moment, I realized that we were not alone, and that the gas station attendant had never really been safe. To this day, none of us know exactly what happened that night. But one thing is certain, we never stopped at isolated gas stations again. And if you're driving at night and hear whispers coming from the woods, it's better to keep driving. The Endless Path. It was 2021 and my girlfriend, Julia, and I were returning from a trip that should have been relaxing. The plan was simple. Drive through beautiful landscapes, forget about the stress of everyday life, and enjoy each other's company. But now we were in the middle of nowhere, driving down a road that seemed endless. There were no lights, cell phone signals, or other cars. Only the darkness of the night, interrupted by the faint glare of our car's headlights. The fuel needle was dangerously close to zero, and the silence in the car was heavy. Julia was restless, fidgeting with her hands nervously, while I kept my eyes fixed on the road. I didn't want to admit it, but I was getting desperate. Every mile seemed to take us deeper into the unknown, and the tension between us was almost palpable. It was then that, like a miracle, we saw a small gas station in the distance. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, illuminated by dim fluorescent lights that flashed erratically. He seemed out of place, as if he had been there for decades without anyone noticing him. Finally, I exclaimed, relieved, trying to break the tense atmosphere. But Julia didn't seem to share my excitement. She looked at the post suspiciously, biting her lower lip lightly. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice full of hesitation. She was always more cautious, while I had a habit of assuming that things would turn out well. This time, however, his concerns seemed more genuine. "We have no choice, Julia," I replied, trying to sound calm. "The tank is almost empty." As we parked next to the gas station, a strange sensation came over me. Something about that place seemed wrong. The post was functional, but there was something old-fashioned about it, as if it were frozen in time. The machines looked like they were from another era. The walls were covered in rust, and the wind blew with a strange sound, almost like whispers, but I tried to ignore it. After all, we needed gas, and that was the only place for miles. I looked at Julia, who continued to stare at the post with an expression of distrust. "Wait here," I told her, getting out of the car and trying to hide my own nervousness. As I walked towards the convenience store to look for the gas station attendant, I felt the wind blow stronger, bringing with it that same sound of whispers. Something told me that this night was far from normal. When I got out of the car, the sound of my footsteps on the ground seemed too loud, as if the silence around me amplified everything. It was as if the environment itself was conspiring to remind me that we were completely alone in this place. The gas pumps were old, covered in dust and cobwebs, but the digital display still worked, glowing faintly. The starlight barely illuminated the road, and the wind made the branches of the trees in the distance sway, creating shadows that danced unsettlingly. I looked at the gas station store, whose door was ajar, revealing the interior illuminated by a flickering light. It looked like a candle about to go out, emitting an irregular glow that made the place even more uncomfortable. The smell of gasoline mixed with something metallic filled the air. Julia got out of the car behind me, but I realized she was hesitant. "Let's get out of here, this is weird," she whispered, holding my arm tightly. Her eyes were fixed on the store, but there was something in her tone of voice that made me believe she felt something I couldn't see. "We have no option, you know that," I replied, trying to sound practical, but my heart was racing. I knew she was right, but we didn't have enough fuel to look elsewhere. I took the hose from one of the pumps and started to fill up the car. But immediately, something seemed wrong. The smell of gasoline was different, stronger, almost chemical. I wondered if the fuel at that station was reliable, but there was no time for doubts. The wind blew again, and with it came an uncomfortable sensation, as if something invisible was passing through us. It was then that I heard it. Steps. They were not normal steps. They were dragged, slow, as if someone were walking with difficulty behind the post. My whole body froze. I turned around quickly, trying to find the source of the sound, but all I saw were shadows that seemed to dance in the dim light of the store. "Julia, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice betraying the nervousness I was trying to hide. But when I looked at her, I realized that she was no longer by my side. She was standing at the entrance of the store, staring intently inside, as if something inside had captured her attention completely. His eyes were wide, and his body seemed rigid. "Julia?" I called again, but she didn't answer. Without saying anything, she stepped forward and walked into the store. My heart sank. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The temperature seemed to have dropped sharply, and a chill ran down my spine. The wind blew harder, and for a moment, the sound of shuffling footsteps seemed to get closer. "Julia, wait a minute," I shouted, dropping the hose from the pump and running after it. But my voice seemed to die in the wind, as if the environment itself was drowning out my words. As I approached the store, I felt that the air around me was heavier, as if something invisible was surrounding us. I knew I had to reach her, but something told me that once I crossed that door, there would be no turning back. When I entered the store, I was immediately struck by a strange and unpleasant smell. It was a mixture of dust, mold, and something else, something metallic, almost like oxidized iron. The place looked even older inside, as if it hadn't been touched by anyone in decades. The shelves were filled with products that seemed forgotten by time. Rusty cans, yellowed packaging, and old newspapers piled up in a corner. The flickering light on the ceiling only partially illuminated the space, casting elongated and unsettling shadows throughout. Julia was standing in the middle of the store, completely motionless, as if hypnotized. His eyes were fixed on something at the end of the hallway. I followed his gaze and then saw what was catching his attention. There was a door ajar at the back of the store, from which came a faint, yellowish light that flickered like a flame. That light seemed alive, almost pulsating, as if it had a will of its own. "Julia, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I approached her. I gently touched her arm, waiting for her to come to her senses. But she didn't answer. Instead, he raised his finger slowly and pointed to the door at the back. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the crack in the door, but it was so fast that I wasn't sure. Before I could say anything, I listened. A voice. It was hoarse, short, but clear enough to be understood. The voice came from inside the door and said, "Are you lost? Between? I can't help." My heart stopped. The voice sounded calm, almost inviting, but there was something deeply wrong with it. It didn't seem to come from a human place. The sound did not echo as it should. Instead, it seemed to fill all the space around me, as if it was resonating directly inside my head. I looked at Julia, waiting for some reaction, but she was still paralyzed, her eyes glazed over the door. "Julia, we need to get out of here," I whispered, trying not to sound as scared as I felt. I held her arm more firmly and started to pull her towards the exit. At first, she resisted, as if she were trapped in something invisible, but she finally managed to take her first steps. It was then that everything began to fall apart. The lights of the post, both inside and outside, began to flicker violently. The sound of failing electricity echoed like thunder, filling the air with unbearable tension. The products on the shelves trembled slightly, as if the floor was vibrating. And in the midst of that chaos, something moved. At the shop window, a shadow passed quickly, faster than anything I had ever seen. I couldn't make out what it was, but its presence made my blood run cold. It was only a second, but it felt like she was watching me, even at her impossible speed. The last thing I saw before total darkness was Julia's reflection on the glass of the door, her face pale and frightened, as the light went out completely. The next moment we were plunged into pitch black, and the silence returned with an almost deafening force. All I knew at that point was that we needed to get out of there before it was too late. We ran to the car like our lives depended on it, and somehow I knew they did. Julia was panicking, crying softly, her hands shaking as she tried to open the passenger door. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching us. My fingers pressed the key into the ignition, turning it frantically. The engine gave no signal. It was as if something was holding the vehicle in place, preventing it from starting. Each failed attempt made despair increase. I looked at Julia, and her eyes were wide, full of tears. "Why doesn't he care?" she asked, her voice trembling. I wanted to answer. I wanted to reassure her, but I didn't know what to say. All he could do was keep trying, turning the key harder and harder. After what seemed like hours, but which was probably only a few minutes, the engine finally started. The sound of the car starting was like a momentary relief, but it did not diminish the panic that was growing inside me. I sped up, leaving behind the gas station that seemed to squeeze the air around us. The heart was still beating fast as the dark road stretched out before us. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe. But then I began to notice something strange. The road seemed equal. No matter how far we drove, we passed the same spots, a crooked pole, a broken sign, and then the gas station again, as if we had never left. My fingers squeezed the steering wheel so hard they hurt. Julia began to notice too. "That doesn't make sense," she muttered, almost as if she were talking to herself. Her voice was low, but it carried a tension that seemed to fill the car. Every turn we made, every kilometer we advanced, took us back to the same place. This time, something was different. At the entrance to the station, there was a figure. Tall, thin, and mobile. He wore a black suit, but his face was impossible to distinguish. It had no eyes or mouth, just a smooth, pale surface that reflected the faint light of the streetlight. Even without eyes, I knew he was looking at us. Panic consumed me. My hands were shaking, but I kept the car moving, stepping on the accelerator. "Don't stop the car, just keep going," Julia screamed, holding my arms so tightly that her nails almost pierced my skin. His tone was one of pure desperation, but also of fierce determination. I accelerated even more, the headlights illuminating the road that seemed to stretch endlessly. But deep down I knew the truth. No matter how long we drove, we were stuck. The road held us hostage, and that figure at the entrance to the gas station seemed to be the key to everything. I just didn't know if it was a key to escape or something even worse. After countless turns, the sun began to rise, and the road finally changed. We found a nearby town and stopped at a restaurant to try to understand what had happened. Julia was in shock, and I couldn't stop thinking about the picture we saw. I told our story to the waiter, who listened to us with a serious expression. When I mentioned the post, he calmly replied, "You are lucky to have left. Most can't. I still try to forget that night, but sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like I'm still on the road. The smell of gasoline, the still figure, everything seems to come back in flashes. I just hope I never find that post again." The extra passenger. It was 2009 and my family and I were coming back from an amazing vacation trip. The road was long, and after hours of driving, my dad decided to stop at a pit stop to buy something to eat. It was a small post, in the middle of nowhere. Those white fluorescent lights made the place look scarier than it should have been. My brother and I stayed in the car while my parents entered the shop. Everything seemed normal until he was no more. While we were waiting, I began to feel a strange sensation of discomfort. I looked out the window, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows near the fuel pumps. "Did you see that?" I asked my brother, but he just shook his head, distracted by his portable game. I looked back at it, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling that we were being watched didn't go away. That pit stop, which was supposed to be just another quick stop, was starting to feel like a mistake. We were told to stay in the car while our parents pulled into the shop. My brother was immersed in his handheld video game, his fingers pressing the buttons nonstop, while I stared out, trying to distract myself. The silence around us was almost absolute, interrupted only by the distant sound of nocturnal insects and the occasional noise of a car passing in the distance. While waiting, I began to feel a slight uneasiness. I didn't know exactly what it was, but something in the air seemed to be wrong. I looked at the driver's side window where my father had parked, and that's when I realized. For a brief moment, I was sure I saw something moving in the shadows near the fuel pumps. It was fast, almost like a human figure, but I wasn't sure. "Did you see that?" I asked my brother, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. He didn't even look away from the video game screen. "See what?" he replied, distracted. I sighed, trying not to sound paranoid. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just a shadow of a tree swaying in the wind. I decided to take a closer look. I fixed my eyes on the fuel pumps, trying to find some explanation for what I had seen. Nothing. The shadows were motionless, and the place seemed as empty as before. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right didn't leave me. "Hey, will they take long?" I asked my brother, more to break the silence than out of real concern. He shrugged, still focused on the game. I decided to shift my gaze to the convenience store where my parents were. The large glass windows made it clear that they were still choosing something to buy. The store looked completely normal, bright, and organized. But for some reason, that wasn't enough to calm me down. As I continued to look around, I noticed something strange. One of the cars parked at the station looked different. It was an old sedan, with peeling paint and windows so dark that you couldn't see inside. I hadn't noticed him before. "Did you see that car over there?" I asked, pointing discreetly. My brother finally looked up, glanced quickly, and got back into the game. "It's just a car. Stop being weird." But it wasn't just a car. Something about him bothered me deeply. I looked at the shadows again, then at the car, and then at the reflection of the store. Everything seemed connected in a way I couldn't understand. Then a chill ran down my spine. Why did it seem that we were being watched? And more importantly, who would be watching us in such a deserted place? While we waited, everything seemed to be returning to normal. My brother was still entertained by the video game, and I tried to ignore the feeling of discomfort. But it was then that something strange happened. He was only 6 years old at the time, and suddenly he stopped frantically pushing buttons and went completely still. It was as if something had captured all his attention. His eyes were fixed on a specific point in the back seat, right in the empty corner. "Who are you kidding with?" I asked, thinking he was making something up or just distracted. My voice was casual, but inside, a small alert went on. He did not immediately respond. When he finally looked at me, his expression was serious, something I didn't expect. Young children rarely make expressions like this. "With the man sitting here," he replied, pointing calmly to the corner of the empty bench next to him. My first reaction was to laugh, trying to convince myself that it was just fertile imagination. "Oh, okay. And what is he doing?" I asked, thinking he would make up some funny or nonsensical story. But his response was not at all what I expected. "He's just looking ahead. He doesn't talk much," my brother said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The laughter died in my throat. My smile disappeared, and for a moment I was paralyzed. I decided to look in the rearview mirror, hoping to see nothing. But what I saw made me freeze. In the corner of the back seat, where my brother was pointing, there seemed to be something. It was not a clear figure, but a blur, as if the air there was distorted. It was almost like looking at heat rippling on the asphalt, but inside the car it didn't make sense. "Stop playing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. but my hand was shaking as I held the rearview mirror. My brother just shrugged his shoulders and went back to the video game, as if nothing had happened. The silence inside the car became unbearable. I looked back at the back seat, but the blur seemed to have disappeared. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was my imagination, but something inside me knew it wasn't. My heart was beating faster, and the feeling of being watched came back with full force. I looked at the convenience store, trying to call my parents with the look, but they were distracted, still choosing snacks. All I wanted was for them to get back in the car and get out of that place as soon as possible. When my parents got back in the car, I immediately told them what my brother had said. I tried to explain it casually, without seeming scared, but I still felt my heart beating fast. They laughed, saying it was just a child's imagination. My mom even commented something about how kids make up stories when they're tired. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. We continued our journey. The silence in the car was filled again by the roar of the engine and the low sound of the music that my father liked to hear on the radio. I stared out the window, trying to concentrate on the darkness of the road. But after a few minutes, something happened. My brother started crying. It was not a normal cry. He curled up in the pew, hugging his own body, and his words came out in a barely audible whisper. "He doesn't want us to leave." My back crawled. My mother immediately turned to try to calm him down, asking what was wrong. "It's okay, dear. There is no one here. You're safe," she said, trying to sound reassuring. But the crying only got worse. He sobbed, repeating the same words. "He doesn't want us to leave." My father, always trying to relax to lighten the mood, suggested something unexpected. "Let's take a picture to remember this trip. It's going to be fun." My mother smiled, trying to follow the game. My brother eventually calmed down a bit, enough to agree. I grabbed my phone, still nervous, and turned around to take the picture from the back seat. It was at that moment that something changed. When I took the picture, for a moment everything seemed normal. My brother even sketched a small, nervous smile, though his eyes were still moist with tears. But it wasn't until I looked at the image that I realized how wrong everything was. In the back seat, next to my brother, there was a face. It was not human. The skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it were made of wax. The eyes were completely black, two spheres that seemed to suck in all the light around. And the smile, it was the worst. Too wide, impossible to be human, as if it had been stretched beyond the limit. The man, or whatever it was staring directly at the camera. My heart raced. I felt my stomach turn, and for a moment I thought I was going to vomit. I showed the photo to my mother, who immediately lost the color of her face. She tried to stay calm, but her voice trembled as she said, "It must be some reflection or a mistake on the phone." My father, however, remained silent, staring blankly at the screen. He didn't say anything, but the tension on his face said it all. I looked at the back seat again, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. Even so, the whole car felt colder, and the air was heavy. It was as if something invisible was accompanying us. And for the first time, I was sure. The man my brother saw was not an invention. He was really there. My heart raced. Without thinking twice, I showed the photo to my parents. My mother, who always seemed calm and rational, turned completely pale. She took the phone from my hand and analyzed the image, as if trying to find a logical explanation for what she was seeing. My father, on the other hand, reacted differently. Without saying a word, he pressed the accelerator, and the car began to pick up speed on the dark road. "You are seeing things," he said, but his voice was tense, forced, as if even he couldn't believe what he was saying. I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I looked again at the back seat, hoping to find some clue or sign. But everything was empty. Even so, the air in the car was heavy, almost suffocating. It was as if something invisible was there with us, watching. A few kilometers later, the inevitable happened. The car began coughing. the engine failing as if it was struggling to breathe. My father tried to ignore it, but the car lost power and finally stopped on the side of the road. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged nervous glances, while my brother remained huddled in the back seat, holding on tightly to his seatbelt. "I'll sort it out," my father said, trying to sound confident. He got out of the car and opened the hood, analyzing the engine under the dim light of a flashlight. My mother got out too, standing next to him, while my brother and I remained in the car. But something inside me said I needed to leave. Reluctantly, I opened the door and climbed downstairs, trying to ignore the growing fear in my chest. It was then that I felt it, an inexplicable feeling of being watched. It wasn't like before, when I thought I saw something at the pit stop. It was much stronger, much more real. I looked around, examining every shadow, every tree by the roadside. And that's when I saw him. There he was, the same man in the photo, standing on the side of the road, a few meters away. He was motionless, with that wide, disturbing smile on his face, and his black eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. My whole body froze. I tried to call my mother, but my voice wouldn't come out. It was as if something was holding me back, preventing me from reacting. When I finally managed to babble, I turned to point it out, and he had disappeared. "What's wrong?" my mother asked, worried. I hesitated, looking back at the place where he was. "Nothing," I lied because I knew no one would believe me. Not after everything we had already seen. Finally, the engine started again. My dad called us back to the car, and we all got in quickly. He didn't say anything, just started the car and accelerated, as if he wanted to leave that place as soon as possible. For the rest of the trip, no one said a word. The silence in the car was overwhelming, but no one seemed to want to break it. Since that day, my family has never stopped at pit stops in the middle of nowhere. And to be honest, I could never look in the back seat of a car without remembering that face. That man, that smile. I don't know what he wanted, but I know he was there. And I know he's still, somewhere, waiting for another unsuspecting family. Years later, while arranging old photos, I found that image again. The face was there, just as I remembered it. The same wide smile, black eyes, and that disturbing glow that seemed to follow you wherever you were. I stared at the picture for minutes, maybe hours, trying to figure out what it really meant. I can't help but ask the question that has haunted me ever since. Who, or what, was in the back seat with us that night? Why did he choose my family, and what did he want? To this day, when I close my eyes, I can see him. I can feel his presence, as if he had never really left. And worse, the question that haunts me is this: is he still around? Lurking? Waiting? Maybe not for me, but for someone who, like us, makes the mistake of stopping in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more stories like this. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos, and remember, sometimes, the mystery is closer than we think. See you next time.